It was the defining global conflict of the 2010s, the tragic culmination of what was once called the Arab Spring, and even today, it is one of the most horrific ongoing conflicts on the planet. Since it began in 2011, the Syrian civil war has been a bloody war of attrition and a desperate attempt to oust President Bashar al-Assad from power. In that time, the war has played host to the rise and fall of a long list of rebel organizations and independence movements. It's seen the Islamic State come and go and come again, and it's been a focal point for the world's major powers, the main players of the Middle East, and a very long list of non-Syrian fighters, all seeking to turn the situation to their own advantage in some way or another. Through the entire conflict, it's been the Syrian people who have suffered the most, and in today's video we're going to chart the course on what ordinary Syrians have been forced to live through across the past 12 years. From revolution to war zone to caliphate to pandemonium. This is the Syrian civil war. So, in order to understand a civil war, you've got to first understand the country where that civil war broke out, and Syria is no different. Since 1970, Syria has been under the continual control of one family, the Assads, whose original patriarch, Hafez al-Assad, orchestrated a coup against a military junta which just a few years earlier he had helped get into power via a different coup. Hafez al-Assad was a member of Syria's Alawi minority of Shia Muslims, and he installed Alawite leaders at many of Syria's bureaucratic levels of power, basically turning the country into a one-party dictatorship. This came with a lot of things: a personality cult for the Assad, strong ties with the Soviets, and most important of all, public discontent. Hafez al-Assad's biggest crackdown against his opposition was done with overwhelming force in the city of Hama in 1982, where Assad's military slaughtered 25,000 people in response to a Muslim Brotherhood uprising in Hama. This harsh of a response ensured that Syrians were unlikely to participate in many further uprisings during Hafez al-Assad's rule, but they planted seeds of resentment toward the regime that would only grow with time. Over the following decades, Hafez and later his son and successor Bashar al-Assad oversaw the transformation of Syria into a patronage system. Under the Assad, Syria's social structure morphed to facilitate a one-way flow of revenue toward the elite in a pattern that was absolutely not unique in the Middle East during the 1990s and 2000s. But all of this came to a head in 2011 when a series of protests in Tunisia inspired citizens in Libya, Egypt, Yemen, and elsewhere to begin pushing back against their own authoritarian leaders. With the help of social media and widely available internet access, this series of protests quickly morphed into the Arab Spring. Every nation in the Middle East and Northern Africa would have at least some level of internal reckoning during the Arab Spring, with the savviest leaders able to placate their population by carrying out reforms and, well, the rest being caught off guard by decades of festering animosity. The first major protests began in Syria on March 15, 2011, a few days after a group of teenagers were arrested in the city of Deira for creating graffiti that denounced President Bashar al-Assad, reading, "The people want the fall of the regime." Inspired by the progress that protesters in other nations had already been able to achieve, Syrians took to the streets, demanding democratic reforms in their government. There were plenty of reasons to protest. A series of reforms that Bashar al-Assad had promised a decade earlier had never come, and a years-long drought had pushed many Syrians into poverty or forced them to leave the countryside. Within weeks, the protests had spread across Syria, but just like in Hama decades before, the crackdowns were coming. On April the 9th, dozens of people were killed during demonstrations. On April the 25th, tanks were deployed to the streets. 3 days later, hundreds of people would die, and numerous Assad party elites resigned from their posts in protest. But it would make no difference. By this time, the Syrian army wasn't just firing on unarmed protesters in the streets. Now their tactics had evolved to include arbitrary detention of men and boys, the liberal use of torture as a tool for either interrogation or punishment, and extrajudicial execution. In order to try and force protesters to capitulate, the Assad regime shut down supplies of food, water, electricity, and medicine, while offering minor concessions. But at the same time, they continued to allow their soldiers to fire on the protesters. But rather than forcing civilians to accept the will of the regime, these decisions had the opposite effect. The protesters took up arms, and when they returned to the streets, they were prepared to defend their right to organize. Individual cities began to plan and coordinate among their citizens, and then cities and communities began working together, and before long, the people of Syria had laid the groundwork for revolution. At the same time, parts of the Syrian army began to abandon Assad, and although they wouldn't defect in large enough numbers to cripple the regime itself, they ensured that the population had not just the will, but also the knowledge to fight back. Now, the Free Syrian Army was formed on July the 29th, 2011, made up primarily of army deserters who were unwilling to fire upon their own people. These troops were likely to have been shot themselves if they'd refused to follow orders, so, caught between a rock and a hard place, they chose instead to form an option where protesters could take up arms too if they so wished. Parallel to the Free Syrian Army, the civilian Syrian National Coalition was also founded during the summer of 2011 with the express purpose of representing the interests of the Syrian people abroad. The National Coalition quickly gained recognition from the US, Turkey, and several critical regional allies. But recognition is not enough to win a war, and with the opposition at a severe strategic and tactical disadvantage to the regime, they were unable to consolidate themselves quickly enough to turn the tide. The Free Syrian Army had a difficult time coordinating its own operations, and it was deeply factional from the start, more of a union of military deserters and a patchwork of Syrian militias than a true cohesive army. The National Coalition likewise had a difficult time securing any material support for the opposition, and even within Syria, enough opposition groups simply ignored the National Coalition that it just quickly became impotent. As a result, even if Syria's armed rebels agreed in principle that a unified front would be helpful in beating Assad, they had little incentive to actually stick with the Free Syrian Army. By now, the Assad regime had been accused by the UN of carrying out massacres and assassinations, using death squads and committing other crimes against humanity, but the strength of this international opposition was not quite enough to get substantial material resources or war-fighting equipment heading into Syria. The rebels had also been forced to retreat from the town of Al-Rastan after a week of intense fighting, one in which immediately got real for the Free Syrian Army in a way that far outstripped anything they'd experienced before. But even though the rebels were later able to take control of the city of Idlib, that success was too little, too late. The so-called Free Syrian Army would continue to be a recognizable name internationally, but functionally speaking, it had become a slapdash assortment of mostly independent movements. It was around this time, at the end of 2011, that the early phase of the war began to concentrate around the city of Homs. A rebel brigade had been able to take control of a neighborhood within the city, and while most militias in most places had been forced to give up the territory they controlled when government forces counterattacked, the situation in Homs was different. Despite intense artillery shelling, that neighborhood of Homs was able to hold out from late October until early March. During these months, both sides ratcheted up the pressure. Rebel forces were able to attack high-value intelligence and military targets, while the Assad regime turned to the large-scale use of artillery shelling and tanks, including in civilian areas. Internationally, Russia and Iran both confirmed their long-standing support of Assad, with Russia vetoing any attempts by the UN Security Council to step in. Across the world, the US and the European Union joined a coalition of Middle Eastern nations calling for al-Assad to step down, but attempted interventions by the Arab League and the UN both failed spectacularly. 2012 heralded a few substantive changes in the war, not least the entry of a new faction, Jabhat al-Nusra, a Sunni Islamist movement representing itself as the Al-Qaeda organization's franchise within Syria. Al-Qaeda and other jihadist movements had already been hard at work taking advantage of the chaos of the Arab Spring, but by this time, Syria was by far the clearest candidate for them to set up shop. Al-Qaeda's spiritual leader at the time, Ayman al-Zawahiri, called for a jihad in Syria to fight against the regime, and when Jabhat al-Nusra proved itself capable of achieving some fairly major battlefield successes, it became a real option for many defected soldiers and foreign recruits who had needed a flag to rally behind. By this time, the city of Homs had eventually been forced to capitulate, and so had the city of Idlib, where some 10,000 people were believed to have died during the brutal fighting. The Assad regime had turned to the use of attack helicopters and other particularly lethal measures, while that UN-brokered ceasefire that we mentioned earlier was in the process of unwittingly being manipulated to paint a more positive picture of the regime. A government massacre of 108 people, including 34 women and 49 children, in late May of 2012 was the final nail in the coffin of the UN peace effort. It was also the final straw for the various Syrian rebel organizations who issued an ultimatum to the government and finally appeared to unify under the Free Syrian Army banner. Al-Assad predictably responded with yet another commitment to crush the uprising, and when the UN ceasefire broke, it shattered. Within weeks, the world began to recognize the Syrian crisis for what it was. Not a rebellion, not a resistance, but a civil war. Civil protests in the capital city of Damascus and the major city of Aleppo led to more and more discontent inside the cities themselves, which had thus far stayed mostly quiet. And in the countryside, the rebels were starting to have more and more successes. The city of Al-Qasari fell, then the town of Sarakib. Then, by mid-July, rebel forces were in a position to make a major push on Damascus. The Syrian defense minister, one of his predecessors, Bashar al-Assad's own brother-in-law, and the head of Syrian intelligence were all killed in a suicide bombing, and fighting began to pick up in Aleppo as well. The Assad regime escalated yet again and began to dispatch fighter jets in Aleppo and Damascus, pushing the fighting in Damascus to the outskirts of the city. But by now, Aleppo was cornered by rebel forces who had also seized valuable border checkpoints shared with Iraq and Turkey. These allowed the rebels to facilitate the flow of foreign fighters inward, get their own people across the border when necessary, and it also brought a whole new player into the conflict: Kurdistan. Now, we've previously written a full military history of the people of Kurdistan for this channel, so check it out after this video if you want to. But to summarize, Kurdistan is an unrecognized international entity, and in fact, practically speaking, you could describe it as a nation, just without sovereign state status. It's made up of the Middle East's Kurdish minority, people with a long history of organized, fierce resistance in Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. And now with the Kurdish diaspora free to enter Syria from two of those other three nations, they were able to form their own well-armed paramilitary groups in northern Syria. In the autumn and winter of 2012, rebel forces took more and more territory in the north, even as al-Assad's jet fighters began a bombing campaign on the outskirts of Damascus. In a weeks-long battle, the rebels took control of a major military base outside Aleppo, and then another in the eastern province of Deir ez-Zor. This was a critical equalizer between the two sides, as the rebels were able to take control of some seriously heavy-duty equipment. Islamist groups, including the al-Nusra Front, took control of their own military base and quickly began taking territory of their own. Shortly after, another airbase fell to the Free Syrian Army. The FSA captured the city and provincial capital of Raqqa in March of 2013, and then more military bases, while in the northeast region, Kurdish forces took command of the area's oil fields. By this time, much of Syria was entirely outside the reach of the Assad regime, and it seemed, at least from the outside, that the rebels were only getting stronger. Now, we should take a moment here to clarify that, as righteous as the cause of the rebels may have been, the Syrian civil war had already gotten really dark. All sides involved, not just the regime, had perpetrated significant human rights violations, and the advent of modern smartphones meant that video could be easily recorded and uploaded from all across the war zone. In one particularly stunning incident, one that shocked the world at the time it occurred, a rebel commander was filmed eating the heart and liver of a dead Syrian army soldier. Of course, no amount of horrific acts by the rebels could excuse the horrific acts of the regime. Just as one example, the regime decided to deploy chemical weapons that same year. But the idea that the regime's acts can't be excused also goes for the rebels. And by early 2013, there was some truly nasty going on all across Syria. But in April of that year, a new player emerged that would eventually make every other faction look tame in comparison. Their name, roughly translated to English, was the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, better known today as ISIS. Almost immediately, ISIS adopted a level of brutality that has rarely been seen in the modern era, and they used a clear social media savvy to broadcast those heinous acts worldwide. Not only did ISIS gain significant support from jihadist hardliners in Syria, but it also attracted thousands upon thousands of foreign fighters to its ranks. Within just months, ISIS forces exploded throughout eastern Syria and western Iraq, taking over cities as well as large swaths of functionally empty territory, but territory that was badly needed for both government and rebel supply chains. The early summer months of 2013 saw the regime and the Free Syrian Army each take and lose significant territory. The government got the better of those exchanges. But by the end of June, the addition of ISIS had turned the conflict into pure chaos. ISIS, the regime, the pro-democracy rebels, the other jihadist groups, the Islamists and the Kurds were all fighting each other, each clinging on to whatever territory they could, and indiscriminate massacres of civilians became an increasingly common tool on every side. Autumn and winter were more of the same, with all sides at war, but the Islamic State taking advantage of the situation more effectively than any of the others. They were able to take and hold the city of Raqqa, despite the best attempts of rebel fighters to force them out, and they made the city into a sort of home base for their operations in Syria. But ISIS wouldn't really explode until the summer of 2014, when in a lightning offensive, the group expanded rapidly outwards in Iraq and seized massive amounts of military hardware before taking command of oil fields and weathering heavy counterattacks from the Syrian and Iraqi militaries. ISIS claimed a number of cities that summer, including the city of Dabiq, which is central to ISIS's own apocalyptic beliefs about a final battle with the West. In a more practical sense, ISIS also captured an important airbase and executed the American journalist James Foley, well and truly putting themselves on the West's radar. Now, it should be fairly clear at this point in history that the US and other Western nations strongly dislike having their journalists beheaded, and as it turns out, they were just as strongly opposed to the idea of such an outright insane group as ISIS being able to plot global acts of terrorism. A US-led coalition began a campaign of airstrikes against ISIS in September of 2014 using fighter and bomber aircraft and Predator drones. With the US and their coalition now active in the area, they had to make the hard decision of which groups to warn before an airstrike was coming, and for the most part, they chose to give that forewarning to pro-democracy rebels and Kurdish militias while being careful to try and not attack the Syrian army. During the first months of the bombing campaign, ISIS was very nearly able to take the city of Kobani, but a combined counter-offensive by Kurdish troops and coalition air power drove them out. The entry of the West into the war changed the situation on the ground in a number of ways. New factions of rebels, most prominently the Southern Front, were able to take new territory from the Assad regime, while another faction, the so-called Army of Conquest, took large portions of the heavily contested Idlib province. In the following summer, ISIS tried to advance again, seizing and destroying the ancient city of Palmyra, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, while carrying out yet more massacres. ISIS was successful in taking limited amounts of territory from the Assad regime, but was forced to wilt again under a constant barrage of airstrikes. In September 2015, Russia entered the conflict at the request of Bashar al-Assad, and while they lent their air power to bombardment of Islamic State targets, they also had no qualms about bombing any anti-Assad rebels that they could find. That included the remains of the Free Syrian Army, which by now was looking less and less like a unified front, as evidenced by the US's parallel announcement that their public program to train and equip Syrian rebels had been a failure. Covert programs were still ongoing, as we know today, but on the world stage, this failure was still a massive boost to the Assad regime. And this is about when the war in Syria began to turn from a truly civil war to a proxy war. And with foreign weapons, money, and equipment flooding in from all sides, none of the forces on the ground had much incentive to think about peace. A number of foreign powers did publicly work toward a peace deal at this time, but with Assad and the rebels both believing they had the foreign support to win in battle, peace was rather obviously not forthcoming. Dual terror attacks by ISIS, one targeting a Russian plane while the other targeted the city of Paris, just intensified the ferocity of the airstrikes launched by both sides. By the end of 2015, Russia and Iran were bent on supporting al-Assad, the US and the EU were bent on getting him out of power, and every force on the ground was bent on victory. 2016 was a year for the Assad regime, first with a bold territorial push backed up by Russia and Iran, then taking advantage of a months-long ceasefire to consolidate their position, then liberating Palmyra from ISIS, and then recapturing the city of Aleppo by the end of the year. Aleppo had been the focus of some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war, and the city was all but leveled by the time Assad's forces took it back. In the process, they had resorted to indiscriminate bombings of medical facilities, aid workers, and known civilian areas. But despite humanitarian outrage, Aleppo was one of Syria's most populous cities, and its capture was a major victory for the regime. Also in 2016, Turkey invaded territory in northern Syria, some of which was held by ISIS and some of which was held by Kurdish forces. Although, to a Western eye, those two groups are very different, Turkey has treated its Kurdish population as a terrorist force for decades, and things were no different in Syria, where they took control of the city of Jarablus and advanced southwards. In the face of foreign pressure, Turkey was convinced to turn its attention elsewhere and focus on the battle with ISIS, but the nation had quite clearly inserted itself as a third foreign sponsor of the conflict. 2017 saw ISIS severely diminished in Syria as its 3-year-long siege of the city of Deir ez-Zor was finally broken by the Assad regime, and its de facto capital city, Raqqa, was taken over by US-backed Kurdish forces. This essentially broke the back of the ISIS offensive, which, as of this writing, has not been able to secure any comparable degree of territorial control for the rest of the war. With ISIS all but eliminated, the US and its coalition had only limited pretext to remain in the area, and despite ongoing Turkish offensives against the Kurds in the north, the US found itself more diplomatically embroiled with Russia, trying to encourage the US to pack up and go home. But the situation changed quickly in April of 2018, when a chemical attack reported to include the use of chlorine and sarin gas was allegedly carried out by the Syrian government. Assad's regime had used chemical weapons in 2017 too, and this repeated offense was met with missile strikes on the regime by the US, France, and the UK. But even in that critical moment, when the Syrian civil war appeared to be on the edge of growing into a far larger conflict, the West ultimately chose not to send troops to intervene directly. During the rest of 2018, the Assad regime and some, although not all, Kurdish factions were able to negotiate toward peace. As they did so, the regime, the Western coalition, and the rebels all pitched in toward mopping up the last concentrated bits of ISIS resistance, but this time it was Israel that complicated the situation badly by launching airstrikes against Iranian targets in May and causing an incident in September which ended when Syrian forces mistakenly shot down a Russian plane. This latest geopolitical near-miss was enough to get Russian, Turkish, and European leaders to collaborate toward drawing down international involvement in Syria as a whole, something which the United States contributed to in their own way by beginning plans to withdraw from Syria entirely. As the conflict crossed into 2019, a new faction, a Sunni Islamist faction known as Tahrir al-Sham, defeated and then took control of a major anti-Assad rebel group, opening up a new front of the battle against the regime. ISIS continued to attack targets as best they could, now operating in a far more decentralized manner than before, and Turkey continued aggressing into northern Syria, taking advantage of the power vacuum the United States had left behind by functionally abandoning its Kurdish allies. But by and large, 2019 was an opportunity for many sides to begin stepping back, setting up demilitarized zones and ceasefires, and taking stock of what had been lost during the war. For better or for worse, the Kurds aligned themselves with the regime and its Russian sponsor in order to try and slow the advance of Turkey, and Russia effectively stepped into the vacuum that the US had left. In the face of this united opposition, as well as increasing pressure from its allies in NATO, Turkey agreed to a buffer zone between itself and most of the Kurdish majority parts of Syria. Seeing this success, most other Kurdish militias chose to put aside their differences and agree to maintain the buffer zone, and with most of the country now under either regime or Kurdish control, Syria was able to turn its attention toward reconstruction, aided by Russia, China, and several regional allies. In 2020 and beyond, the Assad regime has continued to push toward northwestern Syria, where pro-democracy rebels continue to hold out, mostly in and around Syria's Idlib province. But these battles have settled down quite a bit, with the regime tolerating rebel groups' autonomy, at least for the most part, and the rebels now lacking any substantial ability to push southward and win an offensive. Skirmishes are still common, but as of now, the war between Assad and the explicitly anti-regime rebels has become a low-grade conflict. ISIS is now no more present in Syria than it is across much of the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. In the northeast, Turkey still does continue limited attacks against specific Kurdish militias, which have been accused of ethnic cleansing against their local Arab population. Turkey's operations in Syria have caused continued animosity with the Assad regime, but attempts by Russia to mediate between Syria and Turkey appear to be at an impasse. At present, rebel forces and the Islamist group Tahrir al-Sham each control some territory in the northwestern corner of Syria. The Islamic State holds isolated pockets of mostly empty desert, while Kurdish forces claim massive amounts of territory along the Syrian northeast. By and large, most of the rest of the country, including the cities of Damascus, Aleppo, Hama, and Homs, are under the control of Bashar al-Assad, and as it stands now, Assad's forces appear to be in a position to consolidate control over anti-regime areas eventually. It's difficult to say exactly when that will happen, but it's far more likely that Assad can defeat the rebels than the rebels can defeat him. But what this balance of power leaves out is the humanitarian crisis that Syria finds itself dealing with. In 2022, the UN estimated that about 15 million people in Syria were in need of humanitarian assistance, a situation that hasn't got substantially better with time. At present, over half of Syria's pre-war population are displaced, with nearly 7 million still in Syria and almost as many living abroad as refugees, mostly in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. According to the UN, 12 million Syrians are living meal to meal, with runaway inflation, fuel shortages, and a cholera outbreak making the problem that much worse. Much of the country's made up of ruins, including many buildings that were once hospitals and schools and for which there have been no replacements. Syria's cultural heritage is functionally reduced to nothing. The Islamic State and other terrorist groups are still active, and over the full scope of the conflict, a minimum of 300,000 civilians have been caught in the crossfire. In all, most estimates place the death toll of the Syrian war at above 500,000 people, although it's entirely likely that even that number is an undercount. In the words of the UN's Human Rights Office, parties to the conflict have cumulatively committed almost every crime against humanity and nearly every war crime applicable in a non-international armed conflict. With such a devastating, seemingly endless war looking as if it might finally wind down, it's tempting to hope that the whole thing might be over in another year or two, and it's equally tempting to accept a conclusion in any party's favour at this point, considering just how much has been lost. But the decision on whether or not peace is even possible is not entirely Syria's choice anymore. With the nation's warring factions so thoroughly exploited in a proxy conflict, any peaceful resolution will have to involve the agreement of many world powers, all hostile to each other. Whether this can happen remains to be seen, but above all, we must conclude with a focus squarely placed on the Syrian people, a nation of tens of millions of innocents who did not ask for war. And after 12 years of war, after the devastation of their homes and their cities, the perversion and polarization of their neighbors and families, and the loss of far too many loved ones, the Syrian people have exceptionally little to show for their suffering. Unless something massive changes, the Assad regime will be the winner of this war, and many of the perpetrators of the war's most heinous acts are likely to go free without repercussion. Even now, Arab nations have reached out an olive branch to Assad, seeming to accept that he will remain Syria's dictator indefinitely.